Okay, so today is Thursday, June 15th. Today's readings come from Romans 5 and the Gospel of Matthew 8. So the relevant parts that I'm going to read from Romans is the last part about the free gift. But the free gift is not like the trespass, for if many died through one man's trespass, much more have the grace of God and the free gift in the grace of that one man, Jesus Christ, abounded for many. And the free gift is not like the effect of that one man's sin, for the judgment following one trespass brought condemnation, but the free gift following many trespasses brings justification. So within a psychological context, I want to start to try to understand what the free gift is. And so it relates to embodied cognition, essentially. So I'm just going to read a note that I made here as context. So in subjective experience, the capacity to perceive creates an extended mind in which the elements of the environment are even understood as part of it. So think of subjective experience, and in some fashion, the objects of the world that are physically distant are at the same time mentally proximate, or close, or local. So the outer world is seen to be at a distance from us, and yet our mental representations of those outer objects are the closest things we have to ourselves. And so this is kind of what I mean by the elements of the environment are understood as part of the mind. They become part of the mind. So this is the basis of transformation of the local mind. That is, that the mind is embodied. And so you're born into the world, you have whatever you want to say about kind of what this, you inherit some kind of cognitive structures and the synthetic a priori that let you, the conditions of perceiving at all. And you may also then have some inner cognitions that relate to that framework. Yet the mental contents are a result of our perceptions. And so the idea is that to the extent that personality is the idiosyncratic predisposition of the conditions of experience, right? The natural variation in synthetic a priori across unique human beings. That's a personality. And that personality or disposition towards objects is realized or actualized in its relationship to that which it ultimately perceives. And so it's suggested here that in at least a certain sense, those conditions of experience that constitute the personality are extended in and through perceptions. And so the disposition of the human being's relationship with the outer world is a function not only of disposition, but also this kind of buffer which attenuates the disposition based on past experience. So consider this sort of metaphysical relationship between predisposition on the one hand and perceptions, the objects of perception, and the perceptions of those objects themselves. They're mediated. The predisposition is mediated in and through its relationship with the perceived. And so the suggestion here is the nature of the perception of the outer world augments, attenuates, modifies this mediating element between disposition and perception. Okay, and so it's suggested that if perhaps the origin or foundation of the predispositions cannot be themselves changed, they're attenuated through this mediating factor between it and the outer world. And those mediating factors are at once perceptions, but also the working of those perceptions on the disposition. Okay, so the embodied mind reaches out from itself, includes its environment, and through this mental interaction with its environment is transformed. That's what I just said. The avoidance of this mutually transformative embodied experience of transformation is at the root of so-called mental disorder. So the suggestion here is that the preservation of the innate disposition towards the outer world and perception, the attempt to preserve that innate disposition, is kind of at the heart of disorder. So there's a certain sense in which the perceptions work on the dispositions to form kind of the content of personality over against its disposition. So we talked previously about the meaning of cultures, and it is exactly that which has been prevented from being part of the culture that will figure most prominently in the perceptions of the perceiving culture vis-a-vis a perceived. So the idea here is that the disposition vis-a-vis the content of perception tends to exclude from this transformative process certain elements. And so those certain elements are the discarded, rejected elements of the perception. And so it's the preservation of it's the attempt to preserve the innate disposition of the personality through the rejection of certain perceptual elements that causes, I'm suggesting here, the disorder and also the basis of conflict between units of this dispositional perceptual system. So consider not only your own dispositions, but the disposition of another vis-a-vis perception. And when there is a meeting of these systems in the world, they interact in a certain fashion, which will again reciprocally influence the disposition and the mediating perception and personality. And so the suggestion here is that the basis of conflict between two such systems relate to the ways in which they attempt to preserve innate disposition. And so what I'm further suggesting is that the means by which a certain individual or culture attempts to preserve innate disposition through the rejection of certain perceptual elements, the patterns of the rejection of perceptual elements, even which also becomes a moral, it's not only a cognitive bias, but also a moral bias. The suggestion is those elements essentially that one culture finds to be immoral, they will see heightened in the other culture. And one kind of suggestion to further on kind of the scientific things we talked about last time is it's these biases which form the basis of personality, which cannot be engineered away, essentially. So there's no technological solution to cognitive ethical bias in the meeting of cultures. There are perhaps technologies that would make these biases less likely to come in contact, but that's kind of it doesn't really solve the meeting of cultural biases. Okay. So the free gift is the willingness to give up on the preservation of innate disposition and the willingness to allow those innate dispositions to be transformed by perceptual contents. And that's a non-moral, that's in distinction to kind of the preservation of the personal disposition is a moral, it's a moral act. And the idea here is that the willingness to undergo the transformation of the disposition through the interaction with perceptual elements, especially the interaction with other human beings, it's non-moral. So the gift is amorality, essentially. Of course, the counter argument here is that if the perceptual elements are immoral in some sense, then the innate disposition tends towards the immorality of its perceptions. And so that is sort of the counter argument. But at the same time, and what we're going to see in Matthew is that there exists some inalienable or immutable aspect of the personality disposition, which is moral. It's moral in the sense that we want to preserve. It's not moral in the typical sense. It's moral in the sense it's moral precisely because it's immutable. Okay. So in Matthew, the idea, they're on a boat, and Jesus is on a boat with the disciples, and there's a storm, and one of the disciples says, "Save us, O Lord, we are perishing." And he says, "Why are you afraid, men of little faith?" He was sleeping, and he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea. And there was a great calm, and men marveled, saying, "What sort of man is this? This winds and the seas obey him." So this is the idea that Christ is the representation of the immutable aspect of the personality disposition. And what one has faith in is in the existence of this incorruptible. And not only is it incorruptible, but it's morally good. So faith is in the identification of the incorruptible aspect of the personality disposition, the identification of that with moral good is faith. Because the idea is that if you undergo whatever immoral torments you undergo, the winds and the seas, you will not be transformed into its evil. Right, because the manner of the transformation of personality is precisely in being tossed back and forth by the winds and the seas. That's the transformational element. That's the interaction between disposition and perception. And so faith is that the immoral winds and seas will not make you immoral, essentially, because you identify the incorruptible with the morally good. And so faith that the incorruptible is at once morally good is the faith in God, basically, the Creator, the idea that God created good. Okay.